Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today we're creating another clone. This time it's of the Pinterest homepage. If you're interested in learning how to do this, stay tuned and make sure you like and subscribe to my channel because I post a lot of content similar to this. Today we're going to build this with very little functionality. We're just going to get the layout in place. If you would like to see me build on this in future videos and add some functionality, maybe change the page when you click a card or show the drop down, leave a comment down below and I will do that in future videos. Anyways, let's get into today's project. Alright, so I've already created a new project with Vue and Tailwind installed. If you don't know how to do this, I will link one of my previous videos explaining how to do so in the corner. You should pause this video, go watch that, and then come back. I've also already added my custom Pinterest colors. Again, I've created a video explaining how to do this. If you don't know how to do so, pause once again, watch that, and come back. I'll tag it up in the corner. Here's my Tailwind config file. I just name the colors primary, dark, light, light hover, and muted. That's just what makes sense to me. You can name them whatever makes sense to you. Once you get your project set up, then we can get started. All right, so let's take a look at Pinterest. We can see they have this top nav bar with search and some buttons, and then the rest is just the feed. So we'll work from the top down, starting with this top nav component. So if we go back to our project, we can delete this p tag. And we're going to create this top nav component in its separate file. So let's add a new file and just name it topnav.vue. Here we can add our template and our root div. And for now, let's just put the text top nav. Now back in our app.vue file, we need to register this component. First, we need to import it. And then register it down in the export default, just say components top nav. Lastly, we can use it just as a normal tag up in our HTML. And now if we go back to where we are running our project, we'll see that top nav is printed. That means we registered everything correctly and we can continue building the top nav. Let's take a look at Pinterest again. And let's look at this top nav bar. So we're going to work in sections here. I'm going to split these three into a section, the search bar into a section, and these last few buttons. So if we go back to our top nav component, we can delete this top nav text that we inserted. And to our outermost div, I'm going to give it padding 3. I'm going to say flex, items, center, and justify between. Now, flex and item center will make all three of these sections in a row and equal, while justify between will separate them to take up the entire width of the top nav. So our first section will be contained within this div, which will also have flex and item center. And this first button will be the button with the Pinterest logo. So we want it to be rounded full. On hover, the background is going to be our lightest shade of gray, so background light. Let's give it padding 3. And then lastly, let's say flex, item, center, and justify center. This will center the image that we're going to insert, which will be the Pinterest logo. I've already added all of the images we'll be using in my public file, or a public folder, sorry. These are for the cards, all these JPG files, and I got these from Unsplash. And then the logo is just logo.png, and I got this off Google. So back to top nav, src is just logo.png, alt will just be logo, and let's give it some sizing of height 6, width 6, and we can adjust this if needed in the future. So let's take a look at this. Awesome, so you can see it's nearly identical to this logo. So I'm going to call that good enough. And we can move on to these two buttons here. So for those two top buttons, I'm going to add some data down here. Got to make sure to return. And I'll call it tab items. This is going to be an array with 2 dictionaries in it, each having a name and a key. The first name is going to be home with the key lowercase home. The second one is going to be today. Today and lowercase today is the key. Now we only have to create this button once. So let's iterate through that array. We'll say v4 item in tab items. The text is going to be item.name. We'll say at click selected tab is equal to item.key. We've got to put this, let's just cut and put that after the v4 so that it works. And then we've got to add selected tab to our data. Separate by comma. And by default, let's have selected tab be home. Now for the styling, we're going to say rounded full on hover. That's going to come later. So what we need to look at, on hover, it's only light gray if it's not selected. If it is selected, it's white text with a dark background. Otherwise, dark text with no background. Okay, so let's add a colon up here and backward ticks so that we can do some JavaScript in here. And I'm going to say, if selected tab is item.key, then we'll have this CSS, otherwise this CSS. So if item.key is selected tab, we will have background dark, text white. Otherwise, we will have text dark and on hover, background light. And then no matter what, let's say padding Y is 3. Padding X, I think, is a bit more. Let's go with 5. We can adjust this if it's not correct. And then let's say font semi-bold. Okay, let's see how this looks. Failed to compile. What did I do? Okay. So I need to say item, comma, I. This is just some Vue syntax. Key is I. All right. So the buttons look good, but home is not selected on default, which it should be. Selected tab is home up here. That's why. So I set it to item.key, which is a lowercase h. So now if we go back, it should look pretty good. Let's compare it to Pinterest. I would say less padding in the X direction, and the top nav needs a little more padding in the Y. So I said padding 3. Let's say padding X3 for this outermost div. Padding Y, let's try 4. See if that fixes that issue. It did. And then down in the button we just created for the home and today tabs, let's change padding X to 4. That looks almost perfect. So now we can move on to the next section, which is going to be that search bar. We're going to create another div for this search bar area, and within it, let's put an input. The input, I'll give it class rounded full, background light, and let's give it padding 3. Then I'll also give it a placeholder that just says search. Placeholder that says search. And let's look at what else. Okay, so on hover, it changes color, and we're gonna need a search icon. So let's download an icon library now. I'm gonna use material icons. And if we just go to this first link and click on Developer Guide and scroll down, we just need to copy this link, paste it in our index.html file right up here. And now we can use material icons. So back to our top nav, in the search bar area, I'm going to put in a span. The class will be material-icons, and the icon is search. So if we go to our input, we'll see there's a search icon and we got our search bar. For spacing purposes, we want the search bar to take up whatever these buttons are not taking up. So to do that, we'll give this div containing the search bar a class of flex grow. And then the input itself will be width full. Let's also give the input on hover. The background will become our light hover color. And then lastly, we want this search icon to be on top of the input. So let's give the div containing these two items a relative position. And the icon will have absolute. So now this takes up the whole width. We have our hover. So we just need to fix the positioning of this icon. And to do that, we'll have to move the search over to the right a little bit and the icon down. So where we had padding 3, let's say padding Y3, we'll say padding right 3, and then padding left, let's do 10, and we can adjust this if it's not enough or if it's too much. For the icon, let's say margin top 3 and margin left 3 as well. I'll also say text muted for each of these items to get the correct text color. And let's test it out. All right, that looks pretty good. So lastly, to finish it off, we just got to get these last few buttons. So you know the drill, create a new div for the section. Let's say flex items center. Then we're going to create another button. This one will be similar to our logo button. So let's say class rounded full. On hover, we want our background to be light. Flex item center. Justify center. This will be to center the icon that we're going to put in there. And padding 3. Now let's put our icon in. We need a span. The class is material-icons, and the icon is called notifications. And lastly, let's make this icon a little larger. We're going to say text 2XL and text muted to get the correct coloring. Let's check this out. All right, I think the icon should be a little bigger. Other than that, we can move on to that red notification bubble. So we'll say text 3XL. Then to the div containing this button, let's give it a class relative. And, sorry, not the outside div. Let's give the button a class relative. And within the button, we'll add another div. We don't need all this spacing. Within it, we'll just put the number 4. And the class will be rounded full. Let's try for now a height of 5, width of 5. We can change that later if we need to. The background is going to be our primary color. Text is white. Let's say flex, items, center, justify, center. This will center the number within the little notification bubble. Then it's going to need some margining. Let's see how far it is from. All right. I forgot to say absolute, the most important part. So this is absolute positioning. Now it's on top of the bell. Let's move it up and to the right. So I'll say margin bottom 5 and margin left 5. Let's see how that looks. Oh, that actually looks really good. Go here. Yeah, I would say they look super similar. So now for the next button, it's going to be super easy because we're just going to copy the button we just made, paste it. Instead of notifications, it's going to be text, SMS, and let's just change the 4 to a 1. All right, obviously it's not an identical icon, but it's the closest one that Material Icons has. So we're going to have to survive with that. Moving on to the profile picture button, we've got our profile picture here and the hover. This will be nearly identical to the logo button. So let's copy this logo button and paste it down here. Instead of logo.png, change that to profile. This is just what I named my profile picture, profile.jpg. I just got this off the internet. It's not actually me. And, ooh, it needs to be rounded full. Okay, and since the logo is rounded by default, where this image is not, so to fix this squishing we're seeing happening, we're actually going to have to do this differently. So we can delete this image. What we're going to do instead is a div with a background image. So let's give this div a width 6, height 6. We'll say background cover, background center, and rounded full. Then we'll have to create a style tag with background image. I forgot a D there. And then the URL is just our path. So profile.jpg. Let's see if that looks better. Yeah, much better. So now it's not a squished profile picture. The very last button is just this caret down, and it's a much smaller hover background. So we're going to do our very last button for the top nav. For the class, let's make it the same size as the image within this top button. So we're going to say width 6, height 6. On hover, background is light, rounded full, flex item center, and justify center. That's going to center our caret down icon. We're going to copy this icon, take away the text 3XL. We're just going to keep it at our base size, and it is called expand_more. And there we have our very last button. So if we compare the two top navs, they look very similar. So we can move on to the fun part, which are these cards. First, let's create a new file. This is going to house the card component. So let's just call it card.vue. Then we can get our template set up. And let's register it in app.vue just like we did for top nav. So we import it and then register it under components. And now we can use it up here. I'm going to put it within a div underneath top nav. This div will have padding x20, and then we can put our card component right in there. Let's take a look at the Pinterest page again. And we're going to design a single card first, and then we will go on to placing all the cards. So on a single card, we have the image, which takes up the entire card, as well as on hover some buttons, sometimes a link, and then we have this text underneath. So let's set up a single card, and then we will get the layout in place. So going back to our card component, I'm going to do my root element, which will be a div. And within this div, I'm going to have an image. The src, let's make this src a prop that's going to be passed into the component. That will make our lives easier in the future. So just put a semicolon here so we can use our JavaScript in the string. And then an export default, say props, and just put src. Now going back to our app.vue where we have card. We need to add the prop src. And for now, I'm just going to put one of the paths to an image in here. So I'll say one.jpg. And this does not have to be JavaScript yet. That's just a string. I'm also in app.vue going to put another div to house this card. I'm going to give it a width of 1/5. And then this card, let's say class widthful, heightful. All right, let's see if that image is showing up. And there we have our image. We're going to give the outer div a class relative. And to this image, let's say rounded large. Relative. Got to make sure we spell things correctly. All right. So below the image, we're going to create the overlay that we see on hover. So this div that we just created is going to have a position of absolute. Let's say background dark, opacity 50, inset 0, inset 0, width full, height full. So this should take up the entire div and overlay the image. Let's see if that worked. There we go. Before I forget, let's say rounded large to this dark overlay we just created to match the rounded corners of our image. Now we can move on to the buttons we see on hover. So if we go back to the actual Pinterest page, we can see when we hover, we have a drop down, save button, and some other buttons. I think, yeah, all of these are a little different. Some have extra buttons. Let's make all of them the same overlay for simplicity reasons. So let's go with this one. We'll have a button up here, button here, and 2 down here. So to do this, I've already just added this div, and it's once again going to have a position of absolute. Let's say top 0, width full, height full, and then we're going to say flex, justify between. And I forgot, we want to flex this column, so say flex column. So this way we can have this top row buttons and bottom row buttons with the maximum amount of space possible between the two. So going back here, let's add another div. This is going to be flex items center, justify between. And this will have our drop down button and our save button. So we'll create our first button here. For now, we're just going to hard code the text, which here it says UI with a drop down. So I will put a p tag and I will say UI as well. Let's make the class font medium. Or no, we'll say font semi-bold, text white. And then next to it, we are going to put an icon. We used this icon already in top nav. Let's look what it was, expand more. So if we just copy this span and paste it, and then we can take this text muted away and make it text white. Let's take a look at that. All right, I forgot we want to flex our button. So say flex items center. All right, so we got this button. Let's add some padding. I'm just going to say padding 2 to this div here. Padding 2. Yeah, that looks a lot better. So we've got that. Now in the same div that is flexed, let's add another button. Oops, this time is going to say save. Let's say class rounded full, padding 3, text white, background primary. font semi-bold. All right. It looks good, but maybe a little too round. So they probably added a little more padding in the X direction. So we'll say padding Y is 3. Let's say padding X is 5. If we go back to this div where we added padding 2, let's change that to padding 3. All right, so now we're going to add to this outer div containing the buttons. We have this div inside of it that has the 2 top buttons. Outside of that div, we're going to create a second div, and this is going to contain our bottom buttons. So we want to flex it and say items center. Oops. And then within it, we'll create our first button. This button will contain an icon. So let's go ahead and say class is material dash icons. And the name of the icon is iOS_share. Now going back up to this button, let's create the class. We're going to say background is white, rounded full, padding, let's say 2 for now, text dark. Let's say opacity is 50, but on hover, opacity is 100. And we're going to do the same thing for this next button. They're identical except for the icon. So switch the icon to more_horiz. And lastly, I think each of these could use some margin. Or no, just on this top button, let's say margin right 2. And we can adjust that if we need to. Okay. It looks like our icons aren't taking. I'm not sure why. Class, I spelled material wrong. All right, fix that. Also, 50 is a little too opaque, so let's change that to 80. Okay, looks a little better. Now, I'm not sure why they're so deformed, so let's mess around with that and see why they're getting squished. My first thought is to say flex none on these buttons and see if that works. It does not work. So let's try saying flex none up here as well. And still not working. All right, let's take the flex none away. This will have to be done anyways. So to this outer div housing these 2 buttons, let's say width full. And then to this top button, let's say margin left auto. This should push them to the other side, but they're still squished. So what I'm going to do, instead of saying padding 2, let's say width 8, height 8, flex items center, justify center to center the icons. And let's copy that and apply it to this bottom button as well instead of the padding. That should fix our issue, and it did. The icons are just a little bit too big. Icons typically are larger than base, so let's say text base for each of these icons, and it should size them down a bit. To finish up these buttons, I said opacity 80. Let's make that 75, just so we can see a difference when we hover. If we go back, that looks good. So the next thing we want to do is only display this overlay when you hover the card. To do that, we're going to have to add some data. So let's go down and do that here in our exports. Make sure to return. And we're going to add, let's call it hover. And by default, we'll say false. If we go up to the root div up here and say at mouse over, hover is true, and then at mouse leave, hover is going to be false. Then take our variable hover, and if we go to this div that has all of our buttons and say v if hover, and do the same thing for our div that has the dark background, then we should only see this when hover is true, which is only true when you mouse over. So let's test that out. Awesome, it's great. To finish off the card styling, we just need to add below it the information we see here. So it's a little different for each card again, but let's make each one look something like this, a title and who posted it. So we're going to do this actually in our app.vue. We're done with the card component, and we're just going to go underneath the card and add a div. In this div, we will have two different p tags. The first, I'm going to say class font bold, and this is going to be some sort of title. And I will obviously change that soon. Right now, we just want some filler text. And below it, it's going to be who posted. So let's take a look at how that looks. The text should be maybe a little smaller and closer together. To achieve that, we will, to this outer div, say text small, leading tight. And finally, I'm just going to say padding top 2. Now that our card styling is complete, we want to reuse this component for each individual card. So let's go back to our project, and in our exports, I'm going to add data like we've done before. And I'm going to add an array called cards. Now, cards is going to be an array of objects. Each object will signify a card. So we're going to have an src for the image. We'll have a title. We'll have the person who posted it. So I'll say user. And we're going to have a recommended board. So I will call that recommended. I'm going to fill all of these in off camera, so I will be right back. So I filled in each object in this array. I just gave the titles, whatever the src was, so title 1, user 1, etc. If we go back up to our HTML, we see we have this div that contains our card, and we gave it a width of 1/5. We're going to cut that div. Let's add a new div, and we'll put this width 1/5 pasted into that new div we just created. This div we just created that we put the width 1/5 within, let's give it a width full. We'll flex it and say flex wrap. Then we will say v4 and we'll say card, comma I in cards. Let's set the key to just the index I. Now I'm looking at this. I actually think we need to take this width full flex wrap out and put it where we have padding x20. Let's give the div we just created where we loop through our array, the class will be width 1/5. Down where we already said width 1/5, change that to width full. And let's also add padding, let's try 2. We'll need that in the future. All right, where we have src as our prop for our card, put a semicolon in front of that. We can delete the string we already have, put backward ticks, and then a $sign and curly braces. This way we can use some JavaScript in the string. We'll say card.src. We're also going to add a new prop using the same syntax we just did. Let's call it board, and it's going to be set to our card.recommended, I think I called it. Yep. Card.recommended. Now we need to register this new prop we just made. If we go to our card component where we have props, add board, oops. And then where we put UI as a placeholder, delete that, put double curly braces and put board in the curly braces. Back to our app.view where we said some sort of title, delete that, do double curly braces and say card.title. Same thing for who posted, delete, curly braces, card.user. Let's go check this out. Awesome, so now we've got all of our cards, all 22 of them for me. All of the hovers are working. It does not look like our titles and users are going through though. So let's try to figure that out. I'm gonna refresh it one more time. All right, it just needed a refresh. Now it's looking great. The obvious issue here is the layout. We want each card to begin where the last card left off, not, go row by row like it is right now. If we go look at Pinterest, that's exactly what we see here. It takes up all of the white space, and this grid style is called the Masonry grid style. It's done using the grid, the CSS grid, and it's a little more complicated, so I don't want to get into it in this video. If you're interested in learning how to do it, I definitely recommend looking up a separate YouTube video on this. But I'm going to do a little bit of a hack that will be easier, quicker, and this way we can continue using Tailwind rather than getting into our normal CSS. So the hack that I came up with has to use some JavaScript. We're going to use a computed property to split this cards array into 5 different arrays since we want 5 columns. And then we can iterate through that new array of arrays, a nested array, and we will get that masonry layout look. So let's add a computed section and a comma there. Let's call it subarrays. The first thing we want to do is calculate the length that we want. So let's create a variable length, and it will be equal to this.cards.length divided by 5. And let's make sure we always round up, so wrap that in math.ceil. Next, we're going to create our constant variable result, which is what we're ultimately going to return. And we're going to create a new array with the length that we just calculated, so length. Then we can say dot fill, and we'll fill it by mapping, let's just say I. We will return an array, so we want to say this.cards.splice, and we'll splice from 0 to length. And then, so that returns the map, which is going to be an array of arrays, and then we have to return our result, which is what we're setting this to. Okay, now if we go back up to our HTML, where we are iterating through cards, let's cut that div and put it once again inside a new div. So I'm just going to paste it in there. Here I'm going to say with full flex, where we had width 1/5, let's change that to width full, and in our new div we'll say width 1/5. Then in this div that we just added, we are going to loop through our new computed property called subarrays. So let's say v for array, or we gotta say array comma I in subarrays. Our key, let's change I to index. We already use I. So our key is going to be index. Change this I to index. And then instead of looping through cards here, change that to our ARR. Let's check it out. fix these lint errors. First, you may not have this issue. Mine's really strict. I have to console log ri just so that we use it, and then new array should have a space. Go back, refresh the page. It's still not displaying, so we're going to check the console. If we just inspect, we can go to console. It says subarrays was accessed, blah, blah, blah. It's not defined. Weird, because we have subarrays right here and computed. Okay. I spelled computed wrong. Spelling is very important. Okay, so now at least they're displaying, but it looks like our flex wrap isn't working correctly. So in this outer array, okay, we have flex wrap. Here where we have width 1/5, take that flex away. That should not be there. Reload our page. And here we have this nice masonry looking layout. When we can compare it to the actual Pinterest page. And they look quite similar. If you want to see some more added to this, like maybe add the drop downs to the drop down menus or change pages when we click the card or something like that, let me know in the comments below. I'd be happy to build on this and make it a more intricate app. But I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure you like and subscribe down below. I post content involving JavaScript, self-taught development, and I really focus on Vue and Tailwind. So if you like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button. And I'll see you in the next video.